Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. We are now learning that one of the longest lasting effects of the COVID-19 pandemic is its impact on education. The latest results of the National Assessment of Educational Progress, known as the nation's report card, show that math scores for 4th and 8th graders plunged and reading scores weren't much better. A headline in the New York Times was ominous. It said, "Colleges face generation of students left behind." Equally troubling, maybe more so, is that math and reading proficiency was poor even before the pandemic. What is going on? I'll try to find out from my guest, Gail Buffalo, an assistant professor and expert on early childhood education at our own City College of New York. Professor Buffalo, welcome.
Nice to see you, Bob.
The recent test scores were pretty shocking, and the Secretary of Education called them appalling. Just 26% of America's 8th graders were proficient in math, and just 36% of 4th graders, just a little over a third. Just 1 in 3 American students was proficient in reading. Now, remote learning obviously played a role in this, but since there were problems with test scores even before the pandemic, there must have been other factors going on. So give us an overview. What are the issues that are sort of troubling these youngsters and making it difficult for them to achieve proficiency?
Well, I think going back several years, our children are struggling because of a lack of school readiness. But when I say that, what I mean is that the schools aren't ready for the children. One thing that you and I have talked about is how Head Start programming, even though Head Start has many faults, actually it makes the place ready for the child, and schools haven't been ready for our children for a long time en masse. And I think that's particularly true in urban and minoritized communities, but not necessarily the only place that we have those problems. So.
And when you say not ready, what do you mean specifically?
So I think that children come in as complex human beings, and when they come to their K-12 education, what happens is they're expected to sit behind desk and learn in typically more of a rote style of teaching that is often, particularly in low-income schools, driven towards that test preparation at the end of the year. Not the NAEP or the nation's report card, but local tests and assessments, and children are constantly being tested, and their whole person isn't attended to.
So the point of the tests, I thought, was to determine proficiency or what levels the children are learning at. And it seems to me that tests have overwhelmed everything else. And I mean, this is not an original thought. The idea that schools and principals and many teachers are geared toward the tests themselves. So they're teaching to the tests as opposed to teaching the children. Is that true, and is that continuing, or are we making any progress?
I think the pandemic could serve to make that worse because we feel like we need to catch up. And if we take a breath and pause to see what did we learn from the pandemic, what did we learn from virtual education, how did families and communities come together, what are the strengths that are there that we can build on, rather than saying we have to catch up, that we've experienced, our students have experienced all this learning loss and we have to catch up, this remedial focus, which we know doesn't work. Remedial education doesn't really work. So I think our children often sit through 180 days of assumed remediation. So I think tests like the NAEP or the Nation's Report Card are really great because they're a snapshot of where our students are. When all the focus is on the test becomes the curriculum, and children aren't learning the social emotional skills, that they lose recess time. That's a key problem even in our state. Children aren't given their outside time, and it's taken away to prepare for tests.
I was just going to say, why did the kids lose recess? But that's the reason why. They use that time. They use every bit of time that they can to prepare for the test.
Yeah, even though they're not supposed to, yeah. So,
Oh my goodness. All right. So this was going on even before the pandemic. And while it may seem obvious to some people, I'm not sure it's obvious to everyone. What were some of the difficulties kids encountered specifically with regard to the pandemic?
so with the pandemic, I'm not an expert on the pandemic. I'm an expert on how assessments operate and how we teach our teachers and how we train and how those teachers work with our children. And I think that what I know about what happened during the pandemic is there was just disproportional services everywhere. There was a lack of broadband internet. Here in New York City, we had major issues with families even having access to high quality internet that can like run a Zoom. The other problem is just children having their screens off because they're in such confined spaces, because they're in small apartments in New York City. They're sharing it with large families, and this is not always the case, but often with our public school children, they didn't have a place to learn from the teacher. And I can talk a little bit about what a schedule would look like, but children as young as first and second grade had asynchronous time of work that they might do with an assumed caregiver, and then they're back for some live time on Zoom. And some of these children didn't have the bandwidth to have their video screen on.
Wow. So just all kinds of
Yeah.
problems. Then, the pandemic was tough in terms of mental health for just about everybody. Obviously, not just for kids, but we were isolated for a period of time. Kids couldn't play with their friends. They were stuck at home. They didn't see their relatives, grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins, that sort of thing. And then, of course, there was the toll of the people who were getting sick and dying. So walk us through what these kinds of often traumatic events, what these things can do to affect the moods and the mental health and inevitably the education of kids.
Well, if we look at education in times of crisis, we have a lot of data in international development education about like what happens when children are learning in crisis. For example, children in refugee camps. Foster kids also fall under this category of children with interrupted formal education. All children who went through the pandemic had interrupted formal educations, and the contextual factors, the social and emotional weight of whatever the trauma is definitely going to take away from the working memory, the cognitive space, the emotional well-being. We need to read. This is, and to write and to study. I think if we just think about like a basic framework such as Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you have to meet those basic needs first. And if children aren't experiencing well-being, their ability to retain information, to hear what someone is saying, on top of teachers' emotional well-being during this time, I think there are all these compounding factors.
One of the things you said, which seems kind of provocative to me, is that remediation essentially doesn't work.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that, and can you expand on it a little bit? Because we hear about remedial work all the time. For a lot of people who aren't educators, remediation seems like the be-all and the end-all for kids who are behind.
Well, I think about remediation in probably three categories and expands K-16. If we think about what CUNY is doing here right now, there is an initiative to end prerequisite, like these prerequisites that don't count towards the 120 credits of a college degree. And CUNY is pushing for co-requisite education. So instead, banking that extra information that somebody didn't get along the way into other coursework. So CUNY itself is looking at alternatives to like a remediation model. In 2011, I believe Professor Chris Gutierrez gave us a provocative notion of this idea of remediating, and in terms of media, re-seeing the student who is falling behind, who we see as traditionally falling behind, and asking more questions, remediating even how we talk about them and think about them. So I think about what CUNY is doing, what colleges are doing nationally with co-requisite education, knowing that the remedial work that we do in colleges often doesn't help people complete their degree. Like we see a lot of people who go into remedial classes their first year, instead of going into that first year math or English, they often don't graduate, or their time frame for graduation, they may not graduate for 6, 7, 8 years. And so that is a key factor in the other way that I think about remediation is I think about test prep as a kind of tutoring, because I do think a lot about how we prepare children for tests and the inequities that are there and some potentials for equity to exist within even test preparation. Test preparation is a kind of tutoring. So when we think about remediation, what if we thought about it more as just tutoring, more support, providing more one-on-one, thinking about class size, small group settings, those kinds of things, and stop calling it remediation unless we're thinking about remediating how we think about all of our children.
It's easy to understand what happens to a college student where the remedial work doesn't work. He or she doesn't graduate.
Right.
If you're a 4th grader or an 8th grader and the remediation is not working, what happens to those kids?
It makes me sad to think about like what happens to those kids. They fall behind more and more. And I think eventually some of those kids go on to be teachers, people in the community, and they are unable to pass skills on to children as well. So we think about the structural impacts of how we think about remediation. So I think the answer to that would actually be, how do we look at co-requisite models in higher ed to think about how we can infuse science, how we bring science back into the core part of the curriculum and make math and science work together as part of like the main curriculum, rather than having a child go out of the classroom to take their science, like seeing these things as parts of a whole.
So if we look at these 4th graders, for example, who are not proficient in, actually, let's define proficiency. If you're a 4th grader or an 8th grader and you're talking about being proficient in math or in reading, what does that mean to be proficient?
Well, it means that you can answer comprehension questions at a level that is marked at a 4th grade reading level. The New York Times, I believe, is an 8th grade reading level. And most newspapers, I think, are at a 6th grade reading level.
I thought I was writing for geniuses. But
well, I think that we overestimate the reading skills of our general population. I think that points to a lot of the other problems that we have. So when we think about reading at the 8th grade level, we're looking at comprehension. And one of the ways that we determine what the grade level is of a reading test is the passages. Really, you think about the sentence complexity, you think about how long a sentence is, the kind of vocabulary that's in a sentence, and that gets the thing that I've noticed about how we measure like what makes a text an 8th grade text, it's how long the sentence really is, and your ability to comprehend that information in a chunk.
When we talk about math proficiency for 4th graders, what kind of math are 4th graders doing? Isn't that just arithmetic?
I think that the math that 4th graders often struggle with is more the foundational fractions, and arithmetic builds on that. But when we introduce the Common Core, and the Common Core brought attention to national challenges that we have. I'm not here to bash the Common Core, but it introduced a whole new way to teach math. The way you and I learned math in elementary school is not how children learn math, and the parents didn't know how to work with their children. And so I think that's another factor too. So you are talking about arithmetic. Common Core started to introduce algebraic concepts as early as like pre-kindergarten, kindergarten. So how we think about cross multiplying, you couldn't do that with Common Core because it's like you're cheating. So some of those like tricks that we learned along the way, you couldn't use those. So I think that we had the pandemic at a time when we were basically recovering from Common Core teaching, and there was still some of that way of teaching arithmetic and math, but we were also, but parents didn't know how to teach it, and schools had different relationships to the curriculum because it had changed.
So I've been reading as a layperson about, especially with regard to reading, about discussions and even controversy over how reading is taught. This goes back several years now. I don't know if something similar was going on with math, but is there a general agreement now about the best or better ways to teach reading and to teach math, or is this still controversial?
I think because Common Core introduced some new ways to teach math in general, I think that maybe math teaching is a little controversial, but I don't think it is as controversial as the reading teaching. I think we've seen a lot of controversy come up around balanced literacy, whole language, and quote unquote the science of reading. People who push for the science of reading really miss that data point within the pandemic that shows that the impacts on reading were less during the pandemic because children were reading.
Right.
That's that whole language. Like they're taking in, they're trying to read newspaper articles above their level. They're trying to understand what's going on. They're in chat rooms. They are reading constantly.
So they're reading even when they're not doing schoolwork.
Right, yeah. And that's really what we think of when we think of whole language. Now, whole language without phonics, without what some people call, I don't like the term the science of reading because it makes it sound like it's this objective. If you teach decoding to children, they're going to know how to read. But if you teach children phonics, you've only taught them a fraction of what they need to know in order to read the world critically and to read anything that they want to read. So
this is not your area of expertise. Your area is early childhood education.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, you're at City College.
Yeah.
And the first wave of the high school juniors and seniors during the pandemic are in college now. Do you have any sense of whether the difficulties they encountered during the pandemic are being carried over into their first and second years of college?
Without question, I think that's not really up for debate. I think what's up for debate is what is the impact of those disadvantages? Are they going to be able to recover that, remediate that for themselves while they're in school? And will they be able to invent new ways of approaching the things, their gaps as they move through college? So I think those are the important things to think about. But yes, they came to college with gaps, not the least of which is just how do you learn in a in-person environment? A lot of students graduating high school and in early college now much prefer the Zoom setting because that's what they were used to at the end of their high school careers.
And they may prefer it, but as an expert on education, tell me about the difference between actually being in a classroom, whether it's early childhood education, whether it's high school, whether it's college, versus learning on Zoom, even if it's in sort of a pretty good Zoom setting. What's the differences and where's the advantage?
I think the question always needs to be this value around engagement. Are people engaged? And it is hard for most teachers and professors to engage a whole class of students on Zoom.
Of course.
It's really hard to do that in early childhood, but I work with people in early childhood who are successful in that way. You can do things on Zoom in early childhood that you can't do in the classroom. Children can run and get something from their home and that becomes part of the curriculum. That's a very child-centered way of learning. We can't touch, we can see each other's faces on Zoom, that's good, but the whole body and that experience of being in a room together creates a certain kind of camaraderie and collegiality. Teachers' ability to assess students' engagement, I think, is also really easier in a classroom in general. And if you see somebody kind of falling off and you have the energy you need to pull them back in, that's typically much easier done in a real setting. That being said, Zoom sometimes works great.
So you talked about some of the difficulties kids were having before the pandemic, and especially kids who came from disadvantaged backgrounds. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that struck me when these most recent statistics, which had to do with the pandemic, came out, is that one of the worst stats came out of Detroit, and that's a city where nearly half of the students in the public school system are poor. Just 3% of Detroit's fourth graders were proficient in math. And, you know, we're talking about close to zero. And that's down from just 6% in 2019 before the pandemic. So before there was anyone had ever heard of COVID, in Detroit, only 6% of these kids were proficient in math. So you told me that in many cases the schools are not ready for the students, but is anything really being done for these disadvantaged youngsters? And whether it is or not, what should we be doing? And it's a complicated question, but is anything really being done, and what should be done?
I think well-intentioned people are trying a lot of different things. I think we've got programming, community-based programming here. I think that there is a lot of effort being put forth, whether it is in the school proper or in the after-school setting. In the case of Detroit students, if we think back to the water crisis, I think that points to a larger value issue, that the nation's children is not, they're not everybody's problem. If they were everybody's problem, we wouldn't have had the Detroit water crisis. We wouldn't have had a 6% proficiency level in fourth grade. I think that points to where are our values, and it's not always about money, it often is, but are we putting our time into community-based wraparound services that don't see these children in their problems? We see the promise of these children and working with them. I think that that's really important, that even in the services that we provide, it's not just distributing services, because then it is a top-down approach, rather than seeing, okay, we're going to wrap around you, we're going to give you all the support that you need, whether it's making sure you have clean water, whether it's making sure that you have the food that you need before, during, and after school, and it's making sure that your parents have things like health insurance, which is one of the key indicators in the Head Start longitudinal study. So looking at all of these things, I think you could just look for data points in that study alone to see what are the things we need to be even thinking about in terms of what children need.
The education seems to be so utterly complex. One, it's the responsibility of local jurisdictions. It's not national.
Nope.
And yet the problems are spread, across the country. If you're just an ordinary citizen, you might be a parent, you might not be a parent, but you're someone who sort of cares about the kids of America. You said, it's not everybody's problem, but if you wanted to make it your problem, what could ordinary citizens do, if anything, to maybe have some kind of an effect, some kind of impact with regard to improving the state of education in this country?
I think having facts, having your anecdotal, your personal experience, working with children, mentoring children, going into the schools, whether or not your children go to that school, I think the more that our children go to our public schools, that can also be a wonderful thing for public school children. I know it's not possible for everybody, but how can you impact the community and also learn about and from the community and with the community? So whether or not your children are in school, in the school down the block, are you there? Are you part of it? So that you know and you see for yourself what the problems are. And then looking at national data, like large data samples, I agree that I'm glad that our curriculums are not nationalized, that's because curriculum is supposed to be community centered. It's supposed to be informed by local knowledge, local information. But getting that larger sample of like these key statistics is important. And being careful of the noise, like buzzwords like the science of reading and getting upset about that and posting on Twitter doesn't really help anybody. What really helps is for you to learn what it means to teach reading and do that with a kid. Yep. I think that's something. And the two other pieces of advice would be to get on local school boards. Join the PTA, be active in local school in events, support parents who have late shift work. to be able to be involved in their schools. School leaders can help find ways, creative ways, and some of them are doing this work to get all parents involved. And the last thing I'll say is, I've heard legislators say that the biggest piece of help that they can get is just having everyday citizens read legislation and provide notes and feedback on like things that are going up for policy and legislation. So,
That's really interesting.
yeah.
We only have about 30 seconds left, but you wouldn't be doing this work if you thought it was hopeless. I mean, you just go into a state of depression. So what are you optimistic about? What makes you hopeful when you look at the state of education?
I think the pandemic, the notion that the pandemic gives us ways of seeing innovation, I'm very excited about that. And putting that innovation in the hands of our learners and our teachers is something I'm really excited about. So that's what I look forward to seeing in the next couple of years.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Professor Gail Buffalo, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And to our viewers out there, thank you for watching. I'm Bob Herbert. See you next time.